Some artifacts are not meant to be touched. When a grieving family comes into possession of a handcrafted doll with a dark history, they unknowingly awaken a malevolent force older than time itself. What begins as a simple curiosity spirals into a nightmare where even the light cannot protect them. In 1923, a reclusive doll maker named Elias Grayson was executed for the murder of his family in a small New England town. The crime scene was grotesque. His wife and 3 children were found posed like marionettes, their expressions frozen in terror. The centerpiece of the investigation, a handcrafted porcelain doll, eerily lifelike, sitting in the center of the carnage. Legends claim that Elias had imbued the doll with his hatred and despair, binding a malevolent entity to it in his final moments. The doll disappeared shortly after his death, becoming a whispered legend, until it reappears in 2024, purchased at an estate auction by the grieving Caldwell family. The Caldwell family, mourning the recent death of their youngest daughter Emily in a car accident, moves into a countryside estate to escape the city's haunting memories. The family includes Maggie Caldwell, a mother drowning in guilt over Emily's death; Tom Caldwell, a pragmatic but emotionally distant father; Sophie Caldwell, a 14-year-old girl struggling with survivor's guilt. While exploring the estate's attic, Sophie finds an antique doll with black, glassy eyes, a cracked porcelain face, and a lace dress. The doll seems to call to her. Despite her parents' disapproval, Sophie insists on keeping it, naming it Eliza. Strange occurrences begin. At night, Sophie hears faint giggles and footsteps in the hallways. Maggie experiences sleep paralysis and sees the doll at the foot of her bed. Tom brushes off their fears until his tools in the shed are rearranged into a chilling replica of Emily's face. Maggie discovers that the doll resembles one from an old crime she recalls from her research as a journalist. She contacts a local historian, Eleanor Vance, who reveals the story of Elias Grayson and the cursed doll. The doll's influence grows stronger. Sophie becomes withdrawn, claiming Eliza speaks to her. Maggie and Tom argue over what to do, fracturing their already fragile relationship. Eleanor warns them that the doll feeds on despair and grief, growing more powerful as it absorbs the family's pain. She introduces a ritual that could break the curse, but it must be performed at the site of Elias Grayson's execution, a now abandoned asylum. The family, accompanied by Eleanor, takes the doll to the asylum. The journey is fraught with terror. Phantom apparitions haunt their car, and Sophie's behavior becomes increasingly erratic. At the asylum, they set up the ritual. As they begin, the entity bound to the doll manifests, a twisted, shadowy version of Elias Grayson, dragging chains of anguish and whispering venomous accusations about their guilt. The ritual requires Maggie to confront her deepest fear, accepting her role in Emily's death. As she performs the final incantation, Sophie becomes possessed by the entity, forcing Maggie to make an impossible choice: sacrifice Sophie or allow the entity to escape. Maggie, with Eleanor's guidance, manages to sever the entity's bond to the doll by embracing her guilt and forgiving herself. The ritual destroys the doll in a fiery blaze, but Sophie collapses, lifeless. Late at night, Sophie lies awake in her room. The doll, Eliza, sits on a shelf, its cracked porcelain face faintly illuminated by the moonlight. Sophie hears faint whispers, soft giggles, and the sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway outside her door. Sophie, whispering, "Mom? Dad?" She gets out of bed and opens the door. The hallway is empty, but the whispers persist, now louder and closer, coming from behind her. She spins around to see Eliza sitting on her bed. Maggie wakes up in the middle of the night, unable to move. The room feels stiflingly cold. She notices a shadowy figure standing near the corner, its form faintly resembling a woman holding a child. As Maggie struggles to scream, the figure moves closer, revealing itself to be the doll perched on her chest, its cracked face contorting into a twisted smile. Maggie jolts awake, gasping for air. She looks over to Tom, who is still asleep. The doll is nowhere to be seen. Over the following days, Sophie becomes increasingly attached to the doll. She brushes its hair, speaks to it, and even sets a place for it at the dinner table. Maggie: Sophie, it's just a doll. Stop treating it like it's alive. Sophie: she doesn't like it when you say that. Maggie, alarmed: who doesn't like it? Sophie, smiling eerily: Eliza. That night, Maggie places the doll in a box and hides it in the attic. The next morning, it's back on Sophie's bed, its glassy eyes fixed on the door as though it's been waiting for her. Desperate for answers, Maggie visits the town library, researching the doll's history. She stumbles across an old newspaper article with the headline, "The Doll Maker of Despair, Elias Grayson's Cursed Creation." The article mentions Eleanor Vance, a local historian and expert on occult artifacts. Maggie meets Eleanor at her book-filled office. The older woman listens intently as Maggie recounts the strange occurrences. Eleanor: you found the Grayson doll, or rather, it's found you. Maggie: what is it? Why is it tormenting my family? Eleanor: it's not just a doll, it's a vessel. Elias Grayson poured his grief, rage, and guilt into it. Now it feeds on those same emotions from anyone who touches it. Eleanor reveals a faded sketch of the dollmaker's final creation, which is identical to Eliza. Back at the Caldwell house, Sophie becomes more reclusive, locking herself in her room for hours with the doll. One night, Tom hears a strange noise coming from the shed. He investigates, finding his tools rearranged into a grotesque effigy resembling Emily's face. The doll sits in the corner of the shed, though Sophie swears she hasn't taken it out of her room. Maggie tries to confront Sophie, but the teenager lashes out, her voice unnaturally deep. Sophie: you can't take her away. She's my only friend. She understands me better than you ever will. Sophie slams the door, leaving Maggie shaken. Eleanor suggests performing a ritual to sever the doll's connection to the entity. She explains that the ritual must be conducted at the site of Elias Grayson's death, an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. Maggie is hesitant, fearing for Sophie's safety, but Tom insists they have no other choice. Eleanor: the doll will not stop until it has consumed all of you. It thrives on despair, and it will not rest until you've given in completely. The family, accompanied by Eleanor, drives to the asylum late at night. The journey is harrowing. Phantom apparitions appear on the road, forcing Tom to swerve the car. Sophie begins speaking in a voice that isn't her own, muttering cryptic phrases about Elias Grayson's life and death. Sophie, in a man's voice: he tried to bind me, but I am eternal. I cannot be contained. Maggie clutches Sophie, tears streaming down her face as the girl's body goes limp. Inside the decaying asylum, the group sets up the ritual in the execution chamber where Elias was hanged. Eleanor lights candles and draws symbols on the floor using a mixture of salt and ash. The doll is placed in the center of the circle. Eleanor: whatever happens, do not break the circle. The entity will do everything in its power to stop us. As they begin the incantation, the air grows cold and the candles flicker violently. Shadows move across the walls and a deafening wail echoes through the chamber. The entity bound to the doll manifests as a grotesque, shadowy figure resembling Elias Grayson, dragging chains and surrounded by ghostly apparitions of his family. It speaks in a voice that reverberates with rage and sorrow. Entity: you think you can banish me. Your grief fuels me. Your pain gives me strength. The room shakes violently. Sophie, now possessed, steps into the circle, breaking its boundary. Eleanor screams, trying to pull her back, but the entity's power grows stronger. Maggie is forced to confront her deepest guilt, the death of Emily. She sobs uncontrollably, finally admitting aloud that she was texting while driving the day of the accident. Maggie, "It's my fault. I killed her. I should have protected her." Her confession weakens the entity, and the apparitions flicker. Eleanor seizes the moment, instructing Maggie to complete the ritual by destroying the doll with a ceremonial dagger. Maggie hesitates as the entity pleads with her, taking on Emily's voice. "Entity," as Emily, "Mommy, don't. Please don't hurt me." With trembling hands, Maggie drives the dagger into the doll, shattering its porcelain body. A blinding light engulfs the room, and the entity lets out a final, agonized scream before disintegrating. The blinding light dims, leaving the room in eerie silence. Maggie collapses to her knees, clutching the shattered remains of the doll. Sophie lies motionless on the cold floor, her pale face devoid of life. Tom rushes to his daughter, shaking her gently. "Tom, Sophie, Sophie, wake up. Come on, sweetheart, open your eyes." Maggie crawls toward them, her hands trembling. Maggie, sobbing. "Did we lose her? Did I fail her too?" Before Eleanor can respond, a faint gasp escapes Sophie's lips. Her eyelids flutter open, revealing her usual hazel eyes instead of the inky blackness they had moments before. Sophie, weakly, "Mom? Dad? What happened?" Maggie embraces her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. Tom joins them, holding both in a protective hug. Eleanor watches, her expression one of both relief and exhaustion. Eleanor. She's back. The entity's connection is severed, but she hesitates. "We need to leave. Now." The room begins to shake again, not from the entity's power, but from the building's structural instability. The asylum, ravaged by the ritual's energy, starts to crumble around them. The group scrambles to their feet as cracks snake along the walls and chunks of the ceiling crash to the ground. Eleanor leads the way, clutching her bag of occult tools while guiding the family through the collapsing hallways. "Maggie, hurry! This whole place is coming down." "Tom, keep moving. Don't look back." The distant wails of lingering spirits echo through the halls, their distorted faces appearing momentarily in the broken windows and shadows. Sophie stumbles, and for a brief moment she looks back at the execution chamber. The faint silhouette of the entity, now weakened and crumbling like ash, glares at her before fading into nothingness. They burst out of the asylum's rusted double doors just as the building collapses in on itself, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the night sky. The family stands in silence, staring at the wreckage. Back at the Caldwell home, the family tries to recover from the ordeal. Sophie sleeps soundly for the first time in weeks, her complexion returning to normal. Maggie sits at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea. Tom joins her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Tom, you saved her, Maggie. You saved all of us." Maggie, staring into her tea. "It doesn't feel like a victory. Not with what we've lost." Tom, "Emily would have wanted us to keep going. For Sophie, for each other." Maggie nods, but her eyes remain heavy with guilt. The next day, Eleanor visits the house to check on the family. She brings a small box containing the remains of the doll, now nothing more than shards of porcelain and scraps of fabric. Eleanor, "I thought you might want this as proof that it's over." Maggie, hesitant, "And you're sure it's over? That thing, it's really gone?" Eleanor looks uncertain but chooses her words carefully. Eleanor, "The entity has been banished, its vessel destroyed, but objects like this, they leave echoes. Be vigilant." Maggie reluctantly accepts the box, placing it on a high shelf in the attic. Weeks pass and the Caldwell family begins to heal. They decide to sell the estate and move closer to the city, hoping a change of environment will help them leave the horrors behind. Sophie returns to school, her cheerful demeanor slowly returning. Though she avoids discussing what happened, Maggie starts attending therapy, confronting the guilt and grief she's carried since Emily's death. She keeps a journal, writing down her memories and reflections as a way to process her emotions. Maggie's journal entry, voiceover. I've learned that guilt is like a shadow. It grows in darkness but fades when faced with the light. I can't change the past, but I can choose to keep moving forward. For my family, for Sophie, and for Emily. The camera pans over the house as the family finishes packing. Movers carry boxes into a truck, and the once haunted home begins to feel like an ordinary house again. As the family drives away, the camera lingers on the attic window. The sunlight streaming through reveals the box containing the doll's remains. For a moment, all is quiet. Then a faint giggle echoes from the box. The camera zooms in as the shards of porcelain shift slightly and the screen cuts to black. The family stands outside the collapsed asylum, staring at the rubble as the first rays of dawn pierce through the treetops. Eleanor turns to Maggie, her face weary but firm. Eleanor, the asylum is gone. With it, the last ties to Elias Grayson's curse should be severed. But, pausing, these things never truly disappear. Be vigilant. Grief has a way of leaving the door open. Maggie looks at Sophie, who is leaning against Tom, her energy spent but her eyes clear. Maggie, we'll keep it shut. For good this time. Eleanor nods, but her gaze lingers on Sophie, who stares silently at the rubble. Back at the Caldwell home, the family begins the slow process of rebuilding their lives. Maggie takes down Emily's old pictures from the walls, not to forget her, but to keep them safe in a special album. Tom repairs the house's broken fixtures, symbolically fixing the cracks in their family. Sophie cautiously starts attending school again, her once eerie silence replaced with tentative smiles as she reconnects with her friends. Late one night, Maggie sits at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paper. She begins writing her story, her family's battle with the cursed doll, their struggles with grief, and their ultimate victory. We thought the doll was our enemy, but the real battle was within us, against our guilt, our fear, and our despair. It nearly tore us apart, but together we found the strength to fight back. She titles the piece, The Doll Maker's Curse, How We Survived the Unthinkable. Eleanor visits one last time, handing Maggie a small notebook filled with rituals and symbols. Eleanor, you faced something most people can't even imagine. If anything like this finds you again, you'll be ready. But don't just keep this knowledge to yourself. Share your story. You never know who else might need it. In a bright, warm room, Maggie sits in front of a camera. Tom adjusts the lighting while Sophie playfully holds up a clapboard. Maggie, smiling. Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm sharing a story that's as real as it is terrifying. It's the story of how my family overcame something unimaginable. A cursed doll, a haunted past, and how we reclaimed our lives. The camera pans over images of the ruined asylum, the doll's shards, and glimpses of Maggie's journal. The tone shifts from eerie to inspiring. The Caldwell family returns home, broken but free from the curse. Sophie recovers but retains no memory of the doll or her possession. Maggie finds solace in therapy, while Tom finally opens up emotionally. As they pack their belongings to leave the estate, Maggie discovers a single shard of porcelain from the doll, hidden under Sophie's bed. The camera pans to their moving truck driving away, but in the attic, faint giggles echo once more. If you're watching this, know that no matter how dark things get, there's always a way forward. Together, we can face anything, even the monsters that lurk in the shadows. The screen cuts to Maggie holding up a book titled The Doll Maker's Curse, Surviving the Supernatural, with her family smiling beside her. If you loved this story, hit that like button and share it with someone who enjoys a good scare or who might need a little hope. And if you want more spine-chilling tales like this, don't forget to subscribe. We're so close to 10,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to us. Let's grow this community together and keep the stories coming. The family waves at the camera as Sophie jokingly holds up the shattered porcelain shard in mock terror. Subscribe now for more horror and suspense.